Heroes come in many forms, but sometimes they're the ones who've been overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten. In one unforgettable moment, a homeless boy becomes the savior of someone who had every reason to ignore him. But what happens next will change everything: his life, and the life of the city, forever. The city never slept, and neither did its subway stations. Beneath the towering skyline, the underground buzzed with life as people rushed to and from their destinations. The air was thick with the scent of hot metal, damp concrete, and hurried ambition. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the tiled walls, blending with muffled conversations, and the distant hum of an approaching train. Among the sea of commuters, a young boy stood apart, not because he wanted to, but because he had nowhere else to be. He was small, no older than 10, his frame swallowed by clothes too big for him, their fabric worn thin by time and hardship. In his hands, a small battered piece of cardboard bore a simple message: "Anything helps. God bless." His dark eyes flickered between the moving legs around him, hoping for kindness but expecting nothing. Most people walked past without seeing him. Some glanced in his direction but quickly looked away, as if acknowledging his existence was too much to bear. Heroes come in many forms, but sometimes they are the ones the world refuses to see. In one unforgettable moment, a homeless boy would become the savior of someone who had every reason to ignore him. But what happens next will change everything: his life, and the life of the city, forever. A train screeched into the station, its wheels grinding against the rails, sending a gust of stale wind through the tunnel. The crowd shifted forward in synchronized anticipation, eyes fixed on the approaching silver cars. Among them, a little girl, no older than 6, twirled in place, her laughter cutting through the monotonous murmur of the station. She was dressed in expensive clothes, her bright pink jacket clean and neatly buttoned, her shoes polished to perfection. She belonged to a different world, one of privilege and security. Her father, a powerful politician, was one of the most well-known figures in the city, a man who shaped policies, whose words carried weight, whose presence commanded respect. But here, in the subway, she was just a child, playful and unaware, her small hands slipping from her nanny's grasp as she danced dangerously close to the edge of the platform. No one noticed. The crowd was too busy, too distracted, too caught up in their own worlds. But the boy noticed. He had spent years learning how to read people, how to observe things others missed. He saw the way her feet teetered too close to the edge, the way the yellow safety line meant nothing to her childish excitement. And then, in the blink of an eye, her tiny foot slipped. Her laughter turned into a gasp as her balance betrayed her. Her body tilted forward weightless for a moment, her arms flailing in a desperate attempt to grab onto something, anything. But there was nothing to hold on to. The train was seconds away. A breath caught in the boy's throat, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. No one else had seen. No one else had moved. But he did. Without thinking, without hesitation, his feet propelled him forward, shoving through the wall of bodies in front of him. People murmured in annoyance, but he did not stop. There was no time to explain, no time to think about the risk, no time to weigh the consequences. The girl fell. The train was almost there. He dove. His small hands grasped onto the sleeve of her jacket just as she slipped from the edge. With every ounce of strength in his body, he pulled, yanking her back with a force that sent both of them tumbling onto the platform just as the train roared past, the wind from its speed whipping against their faces. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the station erupted. Gasps filled the air. People rushed forward, their eyes wide with shock, their hands covering their mouths as they processed what had just happened. The nanny, who had been oblivious until that very second, let out a shriek as she snatched the girl into her arms, sobbing into her golden curls. The little girl, shaken but unharmed, blinked up at her rescuer, her small hand still wrapped tightly around his wrist. The boy lay on his back, breathing hard, his heart still racing in his chest. He had saved her. He had actually saved her. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, every eye in the station was on him. But not in the way he was used to. The city had never been kind to him. The boy had known its streets for as long as he could remember, wandering through alleys and subway stations, finding shelter wherever he could. He did not have a home to return to. No warm bed waiting for him at night. No one to tuck him in with whispered reassurances that tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow was never promised. It was only another day of survival. He learned early on how to navigate a world that did not care for children like him. He knew which dumpsters held the precious scraps, which subway stations had vents that let out enough heat to keep him warm in the winter, and which parts of the city to avoid when the night turned dangerous. Despite everything, the boy had never let the world harden him. He had seen cruelty, felt the sting of hunger, and heard the whispers of people who walked past him, pretending he did not exist. Yet his heart remained open. When he found a half-eaten sandwich, he split it with someone who had less. When he saw another child shivering on the sidewalk, he offered them the tattered blanket he carried with him. He did not do it for recognition or reward. He did it because he knew what it was like to have nothing. And if kindness was the only thing he could afford to give, then he would give it freely. But the world did not always return kindness. Most people ignored him, their eyes sliding past him as if he were nothing more than a shadow. Others looked at him with disgust, muttering under their breath, clutching their belongings a little tighter as they walked by. Sometimes, security guards forced him to leave places he had been sitting for hours, as if his presence alone was an inconvenience. He had learned long ago that being homeless meant being invisible. People saw what they wanted to see, and no one wanted to see a child without a home. The girl he had saved came from a different world, one that existed far above his own. She had never known hunger, never had to wonder where she would sleep at night. Her home was a mansion, her closet filled with clothes carefully selected by personal shoppers. She did not need to ask strangers for food, or spend nights curled up in the corner of a subway station, listening to the distant sound of footsteps fading into the darkness. Her father was one of the most powerful men in the city. His name was spoken with respect, his influence shaping laws and policies that affected thousands. He stood in front of podiums, cameras flashing, speaking of the city's progress while never truly seeing those who were left behind. His world was one of luxury, where problems were discussed over fine wine and expensive dinners, never experienced firsthand. The girl, like many children born into privilege, had never questioned the world around her. She had never wondered why some people had so little while she had so much. It was not out of cruelty or selfishness. She simply did not know. Her life was filled with soft pillows, warm meals, and an endless stream of toys to entertain her. She played in backyards larger than most city parks, rode in cars that shielded her from the people walking outside. The streets were something she passed through, never something she lived in. But in that moment on the subway platform, none of that had mattered. Her wealth had not protected her. Her father's power had not saved her. The world she had known had disappeared the moment she lost her balance, and when she had needed help the most, it had not come from the people who shared her world. It had come from a boy who had nothing to his name but his courage. The difference between them had never been clearer. The boy had lived in a world where people ignored him, and yet he had not hesitated to act. The girl had lived in a world where people catered to her, and yet, in the moment of her greatest vulnerability, she had been powerless. And now, because of him, she was alive. The train's headlights cut through the dim station, its arrival marked by a deep rumble that vibrated through the platform. The sound grew louder, a signal that it was only seconds away. The rush-hour crowd remained oblivious, their attention fixed on their phones, their thoughts lost in the motions of their daily commute. But in the midst of the packed station, a moment of impending tragedy unfolded, one that no one noticed until it was almost too late. The little girl, dressed in her pristine pink jacket, twirled playfully near the edge of the platform. She had no sense of the danger creeping up behind her, no understanding of how close she was to a deadly mistake. The yellow safety line meant nothing to her, just a strip of paint beneath her feet. The nanny, distracted and unaware, stood several feet away, assuming the child was safe. Then, in a single misstep, everything changed. Her tiny foot slid forward, catching against the edge of the platform. Gravity pulled her down. Her arms flailed in the air, fingers grasping at nothing but empty space. The weight of her fall carried her forward, her body tilting dangerously over the tracks. In that split second, as the train thundered closer, there was no time for her to scream, no time for her to understand what was happening. But someone saw her. The boy had been standing off to the side, unnoticed as always, holding his tattered cardboard sign in one hand. But his eyes were always watching, always aware. It was how he survived on the streets, by paying attention to the things others ignored. And now, his gaze locked onto the little girl just as her foot slipped. His body reacted before his mind had time to think. He moved. His small frame darted forward, his heart hammering as he pushed through the wall of people who hadn't yet realized what was happening. Someone muttered in annoyance as he shoved past them, but he did not stop. His feet pounded against the platform, moving faster than they ever had before. Every second mattered. Every breath counted. The girl was falling. The train was coming. A surge of adrenaline shot through him, drowning out the fear that should have paralyzed him. Just as her body tipped past the point of no return, he lunged, stretching out his arm with every ounce of strength he had. His fingers closed around her wrist. With a force he did not know he possessed, he pulled. The girl's weight nearly dragged him forward, but he planted his feet, gripping her tightly, yanking her back with everything in him. She tumbled into his chest, her small hands clutching at his torn hoodie. And then, in the very next instant, the train blasted past, a gust of air nearly knocking them both off their feet. It had missed her by inches. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The crowd, previously lost in their own worlds, had now come to a standstill. Their eyes, wide with shock, were locked onto the two figures at the center of the platform, the small, disheveled boy and the frightened little girl still clinging to him. Gasps rippled through the station as people finally understood what had just happened. Some covered their mouths, their faces frozen in disbelief. Others exchanged looks of awe, unable to comprehend how close the child had come to death. The nanny, finally realizing the danger, rushed forward, her face pale, her voice trembling as she scooped the girl into her arms. The girl's wide, teary eyes never left the boy. She did not understand what had just happened, not entirely. But she knew one thing. He had saved her. The boy stood there, breathless, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just done. His hands still shook from the force of the rescue, his mind still catching up to the fact that he had made it in time. Around him, the stares continued. Some eyes were filled with admiration, others with guilt. No one had moved. No one had acted. And yet a child, one they had ignored moments ago, had risked everything without hesitation. What would you do in this moment? When faced with danger, sometimes the most unlikely heroes step up. Where are you watching from? And do you think anyone else would have done the same? Let us know in the comments. The subway station, once a blur of routine and indifference, now stood frozen in the weight of what had just happened. The train had come and gone, but in its wake, it had left behind something far greater than the usual rush-hour chaos. It had left behind a moment that no one could ignore. A moment where a boy, invisible to the world just minutes ago, had stepped into the light. The whispers began almost immediately. At first, they were hushed, stunned murmurs exchanged between wide-eyed commuters who had witnessed the impossible. Then, like wildfire, the whispers grew louder, spreading through the station, past the tiled corridors, beyond the underground, and into the city streets. People repeated the story in awe, how a homeless boy had saved the life of the politician's daughter, how he had risked everything while others stood still, how he had proved that courage had nothing to do with where someone came from. Someone pulled out their phone, snapping a picture of the boy standing breathless on the platform, his hands still shaking from the weight of what had just happened. Others followed. Videos were recorded. Social media flooded with images of him, his ragged clothes in stark contrast to the pristine pink jacket of the girl he had saved. The caption underneath was the same across every post. The subway hero. Meanwhile, above ground, the world kept moving until the call came in. The politician had been in the middle of a meeting when his phone buzzed. At first, he ignored it. Then another call came, then another. His assistant's face had gone pale as she leaned in, whispering something urgent in his ear. His daughter, the subway, an accident. But she was alive, saved. He did not remember much after that. The car ride was a blur, his hands gripping the edge of the seat as his driver wove through traffic. A mixture of fear and relief battled inside him. He had spent years shaping policies, standing at podiums, making speeches about safety and progress. But none of that mattered now. Only one thought remained. She could have died. When he arrived at the station, the flashing lights of news cameras greeted him before he even stepped inside. Reporters clamored for his attention, microphones pushed forward, questions shouted over one another. "Mr. Harrington, your daughter was saved by a homeless boy. Do you have a statement? How do you feel about the hero who risked his life for her? What do you plan to do about this?" His mind barely registered the words as he pushed past them, his heart racing as he scanned the crowd. Then he saw her. His daughter stood safe in the arms of her nanny, shaken but unharmed. Relief nearly brought him to his knees. He pulled her close, holding her tightly, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice still trembling. "The boy saved me." It was then that he turned and saw him. The boy stood a few feet away, his posture hesitant, as if unsure whether he should still be here. His clothes were torn, his face smudged with dirt, his sign, forgotten now, still clutched in his hand. He did not look like a hero, and yet the weight of the moment said otherwise. For the first time in his life, the politician found himself speechless. He had spent years believing that people like this boy were statistics, problems to be solved, numbers in reports he never truly read. But standing here now, staring at the child who had risked everything for his daughter, those beliefs cracked at the edges. "Thank you," he said finally. The words felt inadequate, small against the enormity of what had happened. "You saved her life." The boy only nodded. He did not need grand speeches. He had never needed much. But the world had already decided that he was more than just a nameless child. By the time the politician led his daughter away, the news had already spread. The boy was no longer invisible. His face was on every screen, his name spoken with reverence across the city. Interview requests poured in. TV anchors debated his bravery. Strangers who had never looked at him twice now called him a hero. And for the first time in his life, the boy, who had lived in the shadows, found himself standing in the light. The next morning, the city still buzzed with the echoes of what had happened in the subway station. News outlets replayed the footage of the boy's daring rescue, and headlines painted him as a selfless hero. But as the world marveled at his courage, the boy remained where he had always been, on the streets, tucked into a quiet corner near the station where the previous day had nearly cost him his life. He had never expected anything to come from his actions. He had not done it for attention, nor for reward. The girl had been in danger, and he had done what needed to be done. That was all. But the world had decided that this was not just another forgotten act of bravery. The world had decided to see him now. That morning, for the first time in his life, someone came looking for him. A sleek black car pulled up near the station, its presence out of place in a part of the city that rarely saw luxury. When the door opened, the politician stepped out, his expensive shoes touching the pavement that the boy had called home for years. He did not walk with the usual air of superiority he carried in his speeches. He did not seem like a man looking down upon those beneath him. Today, he was just a father who had nearly lost his daughter and had been saved by the very type of person he had once ignored. The boy watched warily as the man approached, unsure of what to expect. No one ever came looking for him unless it was to make him leave. But this time was different. The politician knelt down so that their eyes met, his voice steady but softer than before. "You saved my daughter's life," he said, the sincerity in his words unmistakable, "and I can never repay you for that. But I want to try." The boy blinked, confused. "I want to help you," the man continued. "I want to give you a home, an education, a chance at something better than this." He gestured to the streets around them, the harsh reality that the boy had accepted as his life. "You don't belong here. You never did. Let me change that." The boy stared at him, struggling to understand the weight of what he was offering. A home, a future, things he had stopped dreaming about long ago. He had grown used to believing that no one cared, that the world would never open its doors to him. But now, here was this man who had once been blind to people like him, offering him a way out. The boy did not answer right away. He had learned that offers, especially from people in power, often came with conditions. He had learned not to trust too quickly, not to hope too easily. But then, the little girl stepped forward. She had been quiet all this time, watching the exchange with wide, thoughtful eyes. She took a small step toward him, reaching out to take his hand in her own. "Please," she said softly, "come with us." It was such a simple request, spoken with the innocence of a child who did not understand politics, wealth, or class. All she knew was that he had saved her, and that she wanted to save him in return. For the first time in a long time, the boy allowed himself to hope. The decision was made. The change happened overnight. One day, he was just another invisible face on the streets, and the next, he was sitting inside a home that felt too big, too warm, too safe to be real. Clothes that fit him were laid out for him. A bed, his own bed, waited for him in a room that belonged to him and no one else. It was overwhelming, but it was real. The politician, a man who had once drawn lines between himself and the world below, now saw things differently. The boy had proven something that shook him to his core. Character was not defined by wealth or power. Strength was not found in status, but in actions. And sometimes, the greatest heroes came from the places society overlooked. The boy's journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, wounds to heal, and a past to reconcile with. But for the first time in his life, he had something that had always been out of reach. A chance, a future, a new beginning. The boy had spent most of his life believing that nothing would ever change, that the streets would always be his home, that people would always look past him, that tomorrow would never hold anything different from today. But now, as he sat at a desk inside a classroom, flipping through the pages of a textbook that smelled like fresh paper, instead of dirt and subway fumes, he realized how wrong he had been. Life had changed. The whispers of his past still clung to him sometimes. He had spent too many nights on the cold pavement to forget what it felt like. He had known hunger too long to ever take a full plate of food for granted. But now, those things were memories instead of realities. His days were filled with lessons and books instead of survival and struggle. He woke up in a bed that belonged to him, in a house that did not shove him out when morning came. He had people who asked if he had slept well, if he needed anything, if he was okay. For the first time, he had a future to look forward to. Yet, no matter how much his life had changed, one thing remained the same: who he was. He was still the boy who could not ignore someone in need, who still carried kindness in his heart, who still believed that the right thing should be done, even when it was hard. He had not saved the little girl for reward or recognition. He had done it because that was who he was, and that was the part of him that would never change. The politician, too, had been transformed by that day in the subway. The man who once stood in high-rise buildings, making decisions for people he had never met, now saw the world differently. He had lived in a bubble of power and privilege, believing that success and status defined a person's worth. But that belief had shattered the moment he saw his daughter's tiny hands clinging to a boy who had nothing except the kind of courage that could not be bought. And so he had made a decision. His wealth, his influence, his resources, he would use them differently now. Not to build his own name, not to secure more power, but to lift those who had been overlooked for too long. He had been given a chance to change, and for once, he did not let it slip through his fingers. Programs were created, shelters funded, policies rewritten. The world would not change overnight. But he had taken his first step in the right direction, and it had all started with a boy who had nothing to his name, except the belief that saving someone was worth more than anything else. The subway station still buzzed with life, just as it always had. Trains still came and went. People still hurried along without looking at each other. Life still moved at its usual pace. But there, in the heart of the city, one moment had left a mark that time could never erase. The boy's story became legend. Children were told about him in classrooms. His name was spoken with admiration in places that had never seen him before. His story traveled beyond the city, beyond the streets he had once called home, a reminder to the world that heroes do not always wear capes. And through it all, the boy remained himself. He studied, he learned, he grew. He no longer had to worry about where he would sleep or when he would eat. He had been given something greater than a home. He had been given the chance to shape his own future. But he never forgot. He never forgot the feeling of being invisible. He never forgot what it meant to be ignored. And because of that, he made a silent promise to always see those who had been left in the shadows. His act of heroism had changed everything, not just for himself, not just for the politician or his daughter, but for an entire city that had once walked past children like him without a second glance. Because in one moment, a life can change. Sometimes it takes the courage of a child to show us what truly matters.